what are your reflections on what you've heard this morning?
We can think about resilience or the absence thereof in a number of different ways, and I'm happy to wax lyrical about that. But we have to think about what the underlying stressors are for many of these communities. Climate stress is, of course, a very significant one for many. But the other one, which we haven't mentioned, is conflict. And I think really, when you start to think about the complexity of those stressors and how they impact on people's ability to cope, it leads you to a conclusion where you start to think more in terms of systems. And the systems thinking, I think, applies to nutrition because you're looking at water and sanitation, health systems, food systems, and so on. But that applies right across the board. And I think that would reinforce some of the points that Simon made earlier on. Think about local economies, think about social institutions to build peace, but also to manage a borehole or to manage resources better. And then, of course, ecosystems, which are really, really important as they interact with climate stress and place further stress on communities that beyond which they can't really cope. So that would be my initial reaction, really.
How do you see the resilience actors in this room being able to do something that can scale up these tiny little projects to a point that they can interact with something significant nationally?
That's the holy grail. But I think that Simon referred, during his presentation, he talked about the need to think in billions rather than millions. One thing that we heard, I think, from all the presenters, and I'm surprised it wasn't couched somehow in the whole term localization, that there's local knowledge there. We as universities and academics, I'm surprised not to have heard engagement with local academics and leaving knowledge, because there is tremendous capacity there as well. How we do this and how we move, I think there's two or three things happening together. Jeremy talked, when he talked about resilience, I think he focused on the absorptive or adaptive components, very much, I suppose, akin to where the audience is at with humanitarian action. But I think there are transformative resilience as well that needs to be taken, and this is the bigger picture. This is what maybe we heard Mr. De Burca earlier on talk about. Ireland, we're not far away from this. I think Whitaker did something in the 50s and the 60s to change us from having a cow at every crossroads towards thinking big picture. And it's funny, I think, while there is that need and the immediate need to help people, there's also parallel to this the need to have 10, 20-year vision. Otherwise, a lot of the people we're talking about, we'd be still giving them an extra chicken or a fruit tree in 20 years' time, if we're lucky. Other than that, the whole world will be in conflict. So there's massive challenges going on. It's a big puzzle, and it's great that we're getting to this stage. I think we have to be thinking ambitiously while meeting immediate needs.
Should you be setting standards to judge your success on nutrition resilience?
I think that's a very important thing. We always have to measure our impact. I think it's slightly gratifying when I talk to others about resilience, how difficult it is when we're all grappling with exactly what it means, and then ultimately how we can measure it. I think nutrition, luckily, is something that we can very easily measure. It's about the dimensions of a child's body, and it tells us a lot about what's happened in their lives up to a certain point. I think with resilience, I've seen a lot of tools now. I've seen a lot of ideas either superimposed onto a community or a context about what resilience might mean there. I've seen a lot of kind of perception tools where the communities themselves try to articulate how they perceive resilience, but then it lacks maybe a hard measurement. So I think there's some kind of overlap and an affinity between nutrition and resilience, particularly around the measurement. And I think I mean, we've struggled with this. We're concerned an organisation that's very much focused on hunger and nutrition. When we talk about resilience, it goes a bit broader. We're not saying, and actually, if you look very carefully about the way the CRAM project is worded, I think we've taken a step back, and we might not name it the same name. It's called Community Resilience to Acute Malnutrition. I think if we took a step back, we would probably talk about community resilience to the shocks and stresses that lead to acute malnutrition, because I think resilience is much broader. So in terms of holding ourselves to account and trying to measure resilience, I think we're not quite there, but I see something in nutrition that helps us along that path, because like nutrition, resilience is multi-causal, it's dynamic, it happens over a child's lifetime, it happens over generations, that it might be a harder measurement that we are able to kind of at least see indications of improvement in nutrition. I think that's what we saw in all these presentations here, seeing the affinity and trying to use it, but recognizing that nutrition and resilience aren't synonymous, because resilience is about more than just linear growth or reducing wasting. That makes sense.
Okay. To what extent, when you two are in the field, have you been connecting into local NGOs, connecting into local academics, or is it very much an outsider coming in to look at the situation?
I work with Helen Young, who is a nutritionist who's been working in Sudan for many years, and the model that she has taken there is very much working with the government and with local partners and local universities and academics from the start. And she's been doing this for about 20 years, and you really do see the result of this, because when you see presentations, when you see dissemination activities, they're done by the government, by the local researchers, and there's a much greater adaptation and a desire for this information, knowing that it's coming not simply from the outside, but working with these local partners. But it has taken her 20 years to develop these partnerships. And so I think in Chad, we haven't quite gotten there, at least from the CRAM research perspective. It was very much me as a Tufts outsider coming in and doing this evaluation. Concern has much better relationships with government organizations, but that does require an investment from the very start, and certainly very long-term investment.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Camilla?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this kind of difference across the sort of fragility spectrum that we're talking about in DRC, in South Sudan. You know, there really aren't that many sort of local academics, local sort of knowledge structures there. We try and work like across all the different sort of sector strategies that we have. We take the approach of sort of system strengthening first, and trying to kind of build capacities before stepping in ourselves. This we can do to a very kind of varied extent in different places. In Ethiopia, in Kenya, you have these excellent government extension services, health extension services, that you can sort of capacity build them to do the job. So if I compare just, for example, the budget spending in South Sudan, where we're targeting 5,000 households, for the same budget in Ethiopia, we could reach 50,000, 100,000 households, because we are taking such a kind of system strengthening approach there. And I think it's just the intensity that you have to work at in these fragile states becomes sort of a lot more resource intensive for an NGO, and I think it's an interesting debate how you can try to operate at scale in those contexts and really make some kind of change, and whether for example we're talking about kind of government trying to work with, even in fragile states, the strengthening government systems there. If you can take a more kind of accountability strengthening approach, could be interesting, where you might need to work on a much more local level, because at the national level you've got quite you've got quite a lot of politics going on. It's very difficult. But if you work at the kind of local government level and work on the accountability of them to provide the services to the communities, often you can, even in fragile states, see some quite interesting results.
It's more of a comment, but sort of maybe it's something that we should be thinking about going forward, that really to push nutrition to be maybe the linchpin to how we can try and bring all the sectors together better.
From our perspective as Ireland Aid, we're thinking that we're learning the most from some of that multi-sectoral nutrition programming about what we need to do. because a lot of it is just about making programming instruments more flexible, saying to colleagues like Concern, you know what, you can use that pot of money and that pot of money, it's okay. And actually maybe one report will do. and that kind of really simple tearing down walls is quite powerful. Another example is encouraging and incentivizing localized approaches. So I think sometimes there's a fear perhaps among NGOs that, oh God, we can't necessarily channel funding to this organization because Irish Aid won't like it. But if we kind of say, don't do, please, because we understand this is important and we want you to build that capacity, whether you are using humanitarian money or long-term development money, that is important. So much of our learning is coming from nutrition in this humanitarian development nexus, whatever that means.
Pat, would you be able to tell us what do you understand by this humanitarian development nexus, and is this an important discussion to be having?
Oh, it's massive.
Sorry?
No, yeah, of course it's important. No, I think it's very, very important in the whole, and it can be couched somehow in this concept of resilience. I think we're grappling even with the understanding. Jeremy alluded to the fact that what is nutritional resilience. I think academically people would see that these concepts have to be understood related to concepts in their own discipline. So when you think about nutrition, you think about body wasting and stunting and all kinds of nutritional values. It's probably understood very differently in the humanitarian and development field, where we think of, and this is where the humanitarian and development come in. Most people, I think, in the audience here, from a humanitarian perspective, of course, they're worried about the immediate needs. The need to build resilience, to build a bit of fat, so that when a vulnerability hits, you are able to cope that bit better. Jeremy referred to the fact that during or after a crisis, you learn, so you adapt, so you improve your ways, so you're more resilient. But then the Holy Grail is where the development, I think, comes in, the transformative resilience that tries to take the vulnerability out of the equation. It might be widening the livelihood base or something, whereby people are no more dependent on agriculture. They have different ways of creating a living or so on. So I think that these are important. Just before I leave, Amina, the lady on the screen, yes, thanks you for your applause. she just WhatsApped me. But she also said to me, please get across the complexities of the urban. When you're talking about water here, we're looking at it very simplistic in some ways. The urban, at the moment, 54% of the global population are living in urban. It's going to be 70% by 2070. The complexities around water, around food, and I go back to what Simon said in some ways. He says, do we know what people want, and do we know what is resilience? Myself and Amina met with Dr. Olungu. I go back to the localization and the local academic, and he says, you go into Corrigacho or Vinandani or some of these, and you assume people want houses. You give them houses, they rent them out to somebody else to take the money to get their food and their nutrition. So it's not that simple. It's very simple in some ways, Marys, and it's not simple in other ways, especially the complexities of the urban.
I mean, and particularly because, Simon earlier, when he was being provocative, was talking about places that are fundamentally unviable. I mean, there must be huge chunks of Sahel and places that are not, people can't stay there. They have to move to a city. That will be the long-term result for many of these places.
That's the scary thing when you see what people are going to the Mediterranean. You see, especially you give education, people don't have an opportunity to use that education. They move, but where do they move? They move to the urban slums. They don't get an opportunity. They move even further. Absolutely. So Yeah, but I think that going back to your question, the humanitarian and the development, while the immediate need is, I think, what I hope that in 10, 20 years' time, while we are addressing immediate needs, which are humanitarian, impartiality, and this is a big challenge of the, without discrimination, the most immediate need, but at the same time that we can hopefully have a situation where it's not just an extra chicken or an extra fruit tree for those people who get their education and move on.